Good morning, all. Dr. Pete here of Dr. Pete and T, and this is Power of the Dog. T is not with us this morning because she is traveling, but to sort of bring her in, here is an image that she encountered yesterday in Chicago, and you can see that in Chicago, the risk of a shark attack is 1 in 11.5 million people, yet the risk of prediabetes is 1 in 3. And sort of the point of my discussion this morning is to talk about the relationship between sugar addiction and metabolic diseases, because essentially sugar addiction is driven by the same metabolic drivers that cause a variety of different metabolic diseases. And if you're like I am and you came into this business at older age and recognize that you have a sugar problem, could be coupled with alcohol too, by the way, the likelihood that you also are not suffering from some kind of a metabolic disorder is pretty small. So to introduce this morning, I want to read a couple of quotes from Bitten Janssen. The first is that recovery can never take place if you do not own your illness. So the first thing is recognizing you got a problem, whether it's the sugar addiction part of this or the metabolic illness part of it. You have to recognize that you have an issue. And then the question becomes, are you going to do something about it, right? And the are you going to do something about it part of this it's crucial, right? If we don't have a commitment to fixing these problems, and I think that they usually happen together. So you have the sugar addiction, which is being driven by the same central metabolic drivers that are causing metabolic disease. You can't fix the metabolic disease, and sugar addiction actually is a metabolic disease. I believe that. And the first person that clued me into that was, in fact, Bitten Janssen, because she went on to say that addiction is a brain disease. So when I first encountered Bitten, I was in a nutrition network practitioner program, and we were on a Zoom call, and she was talking about this. And I come to this from the point of view of biochemistry, and I have been immersed in the fructose uric acid biochemical pathway and how that pathway is connected to other pathways, right? Because all of these pathways are working together in concert. And one of the issues that I believe exists not only in our space, but also in the medical establishment and the biochemistry establishment, is that we tend to look at these biochemical pathways as individual pathways. We think about them as a series of steps and only in the context of that particular series of steps. And this is a failing, because we're dealing here with complex human systems, and systems are complex because they depend on all these different factors. Nothing in a system happens on its own without influencing everything else. And one of the biggest challenges that I have faced as a scientist, and then trying to coach and help people reverse, for example, sugar addiction, to reverse prediabetes or diabetes, the obesity issue, cardiovascular disease. A specialty area of mine is in gout remission, as an example, helping people contend with those issues. I realized 4 years ago that you can't look at this from the point of view of a singular type of biochemical pathway. If you do that and you're not able to step away, then you can't understand the problem. And this will limit our thinking about strategies to help people deal with these issues. Including myself, because 4 years ago I was pre-diabetic and I was a gout sufferer. And as I got into the literature, I realized these two things were related. And if you've been following myself and my daughter here on Sugar Bomb, then you know I've talked about fructose uric acid pathway a lot. And these days, I spend a tremendous amount of time in hundreds of different publications trying to understand and get a handle on how that pathway is connected to other pathways. And this morning, I'm going to touch on the fact that when we talk about glucose, right, and eating meals that are high in glucose, hyperglycemic, that glucose enters into the glycolytic pathway, which then ties into the tricarboxylic acid pathway, or the Krebs cycle, right? And again, when we listen to scientists talking about, or experts in this field, even in this space, when they're talking about glycolysis and then the mitochondrial aspect of this, right? The TCA or Krebs, they tend to talk about that cycle isolated from the influence of the fructose uric acid pathway. And we absolutely cannot do that. The two pathways are interconnected. They talk to one another all the time. And for those of us that are suffering from sugar addiction or any of these other metabolic diseases, we have been in an eating situation where it is possible that we have alcohol present at the same time as hyperglycemia, at the same time for the presence of high quantities of fructose coming in with added sugar. And we have to understand that the hyperglycemia has an influence on its pathway, the glycolysis. And if glycolysis gets filled up, which it does in a hyperglycemic event, which is typical of the standard American diet, then the glycolysis pathway talks heavily with the fructose uric acid pathway, and up to 30% of that glucose sitting at the head of glycolysis is diverted into endogenous fructose, which has a significant influence on what's going on in the liver. The first thing that happens is that the energy currency, of which ATP is one of the prominent molecules that we use as molecular money to drive our biology, to do everything that it is we need to do. For me to sit here and talk with you this morning, that requires energy. That requires molecular energy. I have to pay up for that. And one of the first things that happen in the liver when we activate fructose uric acid metabolism is that we almost completely deplete the ATP, the molecular money that's in the liver. That's the first thing that happens, along with the phosphate. The second thing that happens in response to that, through a series of chemical steps, is we get this sudden acute rise in intracellular uric acid. And uric acid is not an inert waste molecule, all right? It is a powerful signaling molecule that drives the inflammatory state in the liver. It drives the disruption or dysregulation of nitric oxide, and it reprograms the liver into a storage mode. So the liver begins synthesizing fat. All of those calories coming in are synthesized, are diverted into fat. And simultaneous to that, the mitochondria is deprogrammed in terms of burning. So it can no longer burn the substances coming into it to produce ATP. So you shut the synthesis down and you divert the liver into the production of glycogen and the overproduction of fat. Now, in terms of the sugar addiction issue, and I've talked about this, you have basically two types of signaling that happen when we activate these pathways. The glycolysis working in concert with the fructose uric acid pathway. We have the signaling that starts with the taste sensors in the tongue. We have signaling that's going on between the liver and the brain, and we have the signaling that's going on between the gut and also the brain In terms of the gut, not only do we have taste signaling there, though I want to point out it's different than how we think about taste, right? Taste in the tongue is like, that's sweet. But the taste sensoring that I'm talking about in the gut, same taste sensors, but a different level of signaling. In this case, more so with nutrient sensing, telling the difference between fructose and glucose, being able to tell different types of fats from amino acids and so on, and then this signaling going to the brain. Additionally, we also have metabolic signaling going on there. So if you're eating sucrose, for example, that's table sugar. Okay, trigger warning, but I don't feel like we can talk about the biochemistry unless I just say what it is. And as that sucrose comes in, it's going to be broken apart, forming glucose and fructose. And that metabolic signaling also is going into the food reward system in the brain. Now, in addition to this type of signaling, in the brain is capable of doing its own nutrient sensing. We have not only do we have the glycolytic pathway going on in the brain to the mitochondria, we also have fructose uric acid metabolism. Who would have thought? And we don't need the arrival of fructose to the brain to activate fructose uric metabolism. Why not? Because hyperglycemia through the polyol pathway activates endogenous fructose, which then collapses into the uric acid. And what does this have to do with food reward system? Because in that metabolic handling of the hyperglycemia coming in, we produce delta phosphate, which all of the substance abuse people over decades of work have concluded that delta phosphate is the pinnacle protein. It's a transcription factor, so it's activating genes that does a whole bunch of stuff. I'm not going to get off on that tangent. But they all agree that this is driving the addictive state. All right, so we have fructose and sucrose that have been shown in animal models and also in cadaver studies to have activated delta phosphate. So this is really an extraordinary thing. Now, before I forget, I want to make sure that I talk about this. If you want to read about the stuff I'm talking about actively this morning, this is Dr. Richard Johnson's book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. I highly suggest that you read this because everything I'm talking about is explained really well in this book on a layman's level. That precludes you having to go read the same literature that I have my nose in now every single day. And then also the book by Perlmutter, Drop Acid. This is centered around the issue of uric acid. And he really goes into a lot of detail in here in regard to the epidemiological associations between somebody who is hyperuricemia and then the associations with all these metabolic diseases. Now, I've talked about my interest before in all of this, and I keep my nose in the literature that deals directly with the clinical work. We did this, and then we got this result, right? That's where I spend most of my time. The epidemiological studies are super important to think about in the context of whether or not we have clinical data. And so the clinical data, for me, priority-wise, comes first. Then I look at the epidemiological work because I don't want to get caught in the same issue that I accuse the medical establishment of most of the time. And this is having some kind of an associational study that they then turn around and use that to make all kinds of nutritional advice to those of us out here. So that when I was diagnosed with prediabetes, for example, one of the recommendations made to me was that I just needed to make sure that I focused eating higher quality carbohydrates. And now anyone who's listening to this that is actively reversing diabetes knows that you have to reduce the carbs, period. They have to come down, right? I don't care if you're eating a plant diet, if you're a vegan, or if you're like me and you're eating meat and you've gone ketogenic, the carbs have to come down. It's that simple. And you just have to look at the clinical data that's out there to see that. Now, in terms of sugar addiction, we know that I think there's plenty of solid clinical data, not talking about associational stuff here, to understand that the fructose uric acid pathway is a central driver in this. And that provides to us, therefore, strategies in terms of our food plan. So, for example, lowering the carbs is probably a good idea. Why? Because we know hyperglycemia can activate the fructose pathway. We know it, right? Polyol is active in the liver, and we need that two-step pathway to go from the hyperglycemia to the activation to the generation of the endogenous fructose, and then downstream of that, getting the intracellular uric acid. We know polyol is active in the kidney, and we know polyol is active in the brain. So, I mean, we have all these things. And if you are a gout sufferer, the polyol pathway has been shown to be active also in the chondrocyte, which is the central, most important biological cell that is in the joint that is responsible for running, the health of the joint. So you can do things without being in pain. And when we step away from that and we do look at epidemiological studies, we know that actually there is a connection between gout and osteoarthritis. And I'm not saying that uric acid is driving osteoarthritis, but we know there is a hypothesis so remember, the epidemiological work allows us to ask questions and develop hypotheses. So we know that there's a strong association between osteoarthritis and gout. What does that mean? It means that there's a possibility that uric acid, intracellular uric acid, could be involved in both. And I'm hoping in the future that we see more clinical studies and animal studies where we can look at that question and try to get a better handle on what is actually driving those diseases, so we can come up with strategies to better help people, put them in remission or in reversal. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about this morning that I want to turn to, because when those of us in this space talk about this stuff, we're always talking about the negative aspects. Like, so, we have this fructose uric acid metabolism that seems to be sitting underneath insulin resistance, right? And one of the criticisms I have of my own space, of which I'm part of, is that when we're talking about the drivers of these issues, right, sugar addiction being one of them, it's really easy to play the insulin resistant card. Now, what do I mean by that? Am I saying that insulin resistance doesn't have anything to do with any of this? And no, I'm not at all. But what I'm doing instead is I'm asking the question, what's underneath it, right? What's driving insulin resistance? Let's go to the next level and ask about that. And fructose uric acid metabolism is a central driver of insulin resistance. It's not the only one. I'm not saying it's the only one, but I am saying it's a central driver of insulin resistance. So when you step away from this and you ask the question, how the heck did humans end up like this? Why do we have a pathway that on the surface of it seems to be doing so much damage, right? It has driven many of us into sugar addiction. It drives prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, the obesity issue, Alzheimer's, uh, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which in terms of pathways is probably step one to getting to these others. It's a symptom of what this biochemical pathway is doing when it's operating on a pathological level, right? So there I use the word again, pathological. So how did humans get to this point, right? That we have this pathology going on. And to understand that, we have to think about evolution, human evolution, in order to wrap our minds around this. And when you start to ask the question, okay, how did we end up overproducing uric acid in the first place, right? Then you have to recognize, when you look at the literature, that the process of eliminating the enzyme that exists in other types of animals that actually degrades uric acid started in us somewhere around 48 million years ago. And it wasn't, and when we talk about genetics and humans, one has to remember we're not dealing here with single genes, right? There's a tendency on the layperson level to go, okay, well, we have the gene for yada, yada. And so if we were to knock that gene for yada, yada out, then this problem would stop. That's not the way humans work. We have multiple gene families, and they all communicate not only with themselves in terms of how they're activated and the consequences of that, but how those gene families, many, many genes, interact with the environment that they're in, influences how they talk to one another. So the process in eliminating the ability to degrade uric acid, it started happening a long time ago, and it wasn't until around 25 million years ago that our capability to completely degrade uric acid went away. And now you might go, okay, so why did that happen? Well, there was an advantage to ancient humans, or the primates that led to us, by allowing the elevation of the uric acid through the overloading of glycolysis and the activation of the fructose pathway in response to that, and incoming fructose. What was that advantage? And that advantage to us was first understanding that when we lived in the forests or on the savanna or in the desert, wherever it was, okay, we most likely were migrating from one optimum condition to the next, right? Our food sources were intermittent, and that meant getting from one source to another. That the only way we could survive that is if we were storing water and fat, because fat provides a substantial amount of calories. And when we look out into the animal kingdom, we can see examples of this all around us, even in today's environment. When you read Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, Johnson looks back historically at this, and he's got, tons and tons of active examples of this right now in 2022 that you can think about. And the one that comes to mind for me is a bear. And what do they do before they hibernate? They go out and they actively eat thousands and thousands of these berries. They're full on ripe, full of fructose. What are they doing, right? They're actively, in a massive way and very efficiently, putting on tons and tons of fat weight. And then what do? They crawl into a hole. That's a metaphor. And they hibernate for the winter. All right. And why do they hibernate, you think, during the winter? Well, they do that because the food sources are down, right? So what better way to get through the deprivation of calories than to sleep? And where do the calories come from that allow them to survive that? It comes from all the fat that they put on by overeating the fructose-laden berries. that they work so hard to get in the fall. Or if you want to think about a grizzly up in Alaska, right, eating the salmon, they're gorging on these things and they're putting on pounds and pounds of fat. So early humans, early primates that led to the humans, these mutations allowed us to survive. And they allowed us to survive because when we came on a food source, we could very, very rapidly put on a ton of fat weight. When we put on fat, we also, when we store these fat calories, we also proportionally store water. So then when we move from that food source to the next one, and we had nothing to eat or very little, right, rations, then we had the fat stores to survive moving from that location to the next. All right. Now, I have experience with this myself, even though I'm not an ancient human. Sometimes I feel like an ancient human, but I grew up in the mountains and I used to teach survivals, and I know what it's like to move from one food source to another, and sometimes having to go days without encountering plants or animals that you could eat, and having to survive that short migration, right? 10, 12, maybe it was 15 miles to get to another location where it was possible to then acquire food that we could eat. So I know what it's like to eat intermittently and having to exert a lot of energy between those locations. So these theories really make a lot of sense to me. The problem is, so this was a very important, the relationship between glycolysis and the mitochondria and the fructose uric acid pathways. These are very important to our survival. And where we get into trouble with them now is that in the standard American diet, where people are eating 5 or 6 meals every single day, and most of those meals are hyperglycemic, we're hyperactivating these pathways, right? And when we hyperactivate these pathways, then we not only are we putting on fat, right? Because again, remember, exclusively the liver is being programmed to do exactly that, to produce this, to overproduce the fat. Triglycerides going into our circulatory system make their way to the adipose tissue. You know, from the sugar addiction issue, we're activating delta phosphate chronically every single day. And think about what's going to happen if that goes on for a long period of time, right? And I was 60 years old when I was diagnosed with prediabetes, and I was 57 when I was diagnosed with the gout. Well, you know, think about time frame here. Standard American diet for about 6 decades, hyperglycemic every single meal. And then we have our other habits that went into that, other things that we're eating along with this, perhaps an alcohol habit, like I had the 2 or 3 beers every single day, right? And in there, you've got, in the beer, you've got you not only have the purines, which Johnson and Perlmutter talk about a lot, you also have a high refined carbohydrate load coming in, and you have the alcohol, which has at least 4 ways in which it is involved in this pathway, right? Alcohol is like hyperglycemia, number 1, in that it activates polyol, and so it's influencing the production of endogenous fructose. This is something the ketogenic community doesn't like to talk about, because when people go down the low carb pathway, oftentimes, and this is an issue for sugar addiction for sure, the red dog is already pushing back, right? It's going, my guy is going to do, or my girl is going to do, they're going to lower the carbs. How do I maintain my drug foods, right? And so the question of the alcohol comes up. I see this in electronic forums all the time. Oh, you can drink alcohol in the ketogenic diet. And I'm saying, okay, wait a minute. That may well be true. But what if you have a sugar addiction problem? Then this can be a problem, because it's activating the very same pathway that produces the intracellular uric acid. And where do we go, people? Right back to the brain and the activation of FOSB. And guess what? Alcohol activates FOSB on its own. We don't even need the fructose uric acid pathway. But think about what's going on if both of these things are going on simultaneously in the brain. Not a good thing, right? So this circles back. And for those of us that are sitting in a place where we're going, wow, I'm 60 years old. I've got this metabolic problem. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, maybe I have a sugar addiction issue on top of that. Then as we educate ourselves, that's blue dog, right? As the education comes in and we're learning and we're gaining knowledge and we realize, okay, to fix this constellation of problems, what am I going to do? Okay, number one, I have to decide, am I going to actually do something about this, right? And that's where the commitment thing comes in. And that can be really hard for some of us. Am I actually going to do something about this? But if I decide I am going to do something about it, then on balance, I have to look at all these issues. I need to know, how sick am I? Am I sick metabolically? Period. I need to know that. Okay. And if I am, what is the level of the sickness? Where does the sugar addiction fit into this? It's being driven by the same biochemical issue. It is a brain disease. So I need to know those things, and I need to be authentic and honest with myself about where I'm sitting, because then this will make it possible to start making decisions how I'm going to deal with this. And that's where we arrive at the food plan. What is the best food plan for this, right? To get reversal, to get into recovery of the sugar addiction, reversal of the metabolic disorders, right? What is the best food plan? And in this forum, you're going to hear lots of people, practitioners like me and others, talking about the differences in their food plans. This is because they've gone through what I'm talking about, right? They have looked in the mirror and said, all right, these are the issues. Now, how do I get my recovery? How do I get my metabolic, not only recovery, but I want to use the word reversal. In the case of gout, it's a remission, most likely. In any case, that's what I have for you this morning.